recorded.
Thank you. Well, thank you for coming to school. Almost a study. Today, I'm really honored to have Professor Hasanuddin Khan with us. He sent you an email with a summary of so many accomplishments and CV, but as a summary, he's a distinguished professor of architecture and historic preservation at William Roger University. He was editor-in-chief of Lamaprakos magazine, which was the major professional and scholarly magazine on vernacular architecture, non-Western and architecture and development in the 80s and 90s. And he's currently academic editor of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture, author and editor of 8 books, and I think a couple of more book projects in process, and also author of 60 papers. He's been involved in Aga Khan Design Awards. He's been a major figure in designing the architecture award program and in overseeing the project. His most current research is architecture and urbanism of Asia. So I really appreciate the time being here. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thanks. Always. I gather it's about to snow. My flight has just got cancelled to go back to Boston, so we'll figure out what I do after this. But I'm going to talk about Jeffrey Bauer, who you've probably heard of, the Sri Lankan architect, and I gather you're talking about Sri Lanka.
Sorry, a quick interruption. I was told by the university to communicate this with you because the university is closed at 3. We are planning to have the talk almost finished by 3, but if the talk is going on a little bit more, if you want to leave at 3 o'clock, please do so. Sorry.
It's supposed to start snowing at about 4, I guess, but yeah, I had said to him, I said, can I make the talk a little longer? He said, yeah, go ahead. So it's a longer talk. So either I cut it off at a certain point, or I speed up and talk really fast. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. We'll see how far we get. So if you could sort of give me a 7-minute warning or something like that, I'll try and keep an eye on the time, and we'll go through Jeffrey. Can you get some lights off at least? Thank you. Okay, that's Jeffrey Bauer. I'm going to talk about Jeffrey and talk about a few other architects because I think it's kind of important to get a sense of where he's coming from and where, in fact, what's happening in Sri Lanka today. And if you take Jeffrey, he's actually perhaps the most influential architect in Southeast Asia and has been for the last 10 or 15 years, or more than that actually. All right, well, everyone knows where Colombo is and where, this is the map centered on Colombo, the center of the world in Sri Lanka. You know the geography. I'm assuming you know these things, okay, so I won't dwell on them. And now if you're working on this, you know where the different places are. I'd like to show you a few slides, which gives you a sense of what inspired Jeffrey and what inspires Sri Lankan architects in general. This is the famous temple precinct in the center of the country. A Buddhist temple, Buddhist stupa, and of course the idea of the sacred rocks, the monks, the whole idea of landscape, the boulders. So it's the question of this rough landscape and of course the dense foliage that affects and being in the tropics and the rains and the monsoons and all that sort of stuff. But this is something that Jeffrey found important for him. We know that Sri Lanka is such a mix of different cultures and different religions as well. From the temples to the churches, and this is back to the CBI. The famous temple at Kandy, which again from the Hindu and the Buddhist movements, and Kandy itself, the old capital, which is in the center of the country. I'm not going to dwell on this because I think you've been, again, through this stuff and know something about it, and you can certainly find it. But I just want to remind us about this, that The other overlay between the Hindu, the Buddhist, and the Christian is, of course, the colonial. And the colonial bungalow, which all in South Asia plays an important part. The verandas around the bungalow, the hip roofs, the air that rises through the center, there's usually vent on them, very much part of the climate, very much part of that vernacular, which he pays a lot of attention to, Jeffrey. There are also ritualistic spaces. The verandas are both climatic, but this one happens to be a space which is actually for feeding Buddhist monks who go around the country and they're not allowed to work, this group, they beg. Okay, and this you find in India as well, you find it all over this part of the world. And this is a place where they get fed, essentially. They come for food, they're fed by the community. They gather these long hallways that go through the 7 mile sidewalk. If you take a look at the structure, interesting combination of sort of classical columns of some sort. The long hallways, the wooden beams and the roof itself, and in this case, concrete balustrades and concrete structures as well. There's a whole lot of old forts in the country, like in most of these places. You've got the Portuguese who came in, you've got the British who came in, you've got a range of different colonial powers that come through it, and they create these big stone forts. And again, the stone forts, the idea of the wall, the idea of the crenellations on top is something that Bauer looks at. The thing about architects is they seem to love picking certain features of architecture and then reproducing them as being authentic, local, all that sort of stuff. Architects do this today, and Jeffrey's no exception. These drawings are by a woman called Barbara Sansoni, who in the 50s, she's still alive, and she's done beautiful sketches of Sri Lanka and the architecture, from the vernacular and with artists. She's an artist, she's a textile designer and works in Sri Lanka. In the 40s and 50s, there's a whole intellectual group of Sri Lankans who are artists, writers, poets, men and women, and they form this kind of nucleus of the intelligentsia. And Bauer belongs to this group of people. So Bauer is very much part of a small elite in the country. And the politicians come from this group and a whole lot of other people as well. And Bauer's group, actually, they reinforce each other. Barbara Sansoni works with him on textiles for his buildings. There's some artists who do drawings in Bauer's buildings, and we talk quicker than a bit. These are other drawings of the Sri Lankan vernacular. Again, very much part of the same veranda idea, the temple. We saw the photographs of the temple, and then these the more larger vernacular buildings themselves. And then, of course, the overlay of Colombo, the town hall in Colombo itself, which is British. And this is a bunch of British architects who planned for Sri Lanka. They're the planners of Sri Lanka. They're the architects who work for the government, for the colonial administration. And this is all over India. You see these guys. British farms are being set up. Whether it's Lutyens in India, who you've probably heard of, being the capital in Delhi. People like Edwards, who becomes the sort of chief architect and does a whole bunch of buildings, mainly government buildings, public buildings in Sri Lanka. So this overlay from the old Buddhist, etc., comes into the colonial world. Overlays are important because the intellectual agenda, if you like, of Sri Lanka really absorbs these and assimilates these and changes them. And Bauer does the same thing too. I'm going to start with somebody else. I'm going to start with a woman called Manette de Silva. She's a couple of years older than Bauer, and she's the first Sri Lankan woman architect. She was a very beautiful young woman. who was the first represented at Siam in 1947. I knew her a little bit in the early days of some of the publications I did on her. And she is, her father was Chief Justice or something like that of Sri Lanka, comes from the same elite family I was talking about, same elite group of people. And she goes to England to study, meets Corb in Paris. There's an interesting story or thing about her that Corb really gets, I won't say falls for her, but they have an affair. So Corbusier has several affairs, as we know, through his life. But she certainly, she goes and meets up with Corbusier in Paris and in Chandigarh. And there's a whole wonderful exchange of letters between her and Corb. And if you know Chandigarh at all, which you may have seen in somewhere, there's a famous symbol of Chandigarh, which is the open hand. And the open hand is a statue right in the middle of the city. And the early drawings of that are things that he did for her in postcards. So you see the early postcard, that's scribbles of Corb. There's a book of her, kind of scrapbook, which has been published a few years ago in Sri Lanka. But she goes out and becomes the first woman architect, the first member of the RI, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and studies in England. Now, of course, the colonial powers being Britain, all young people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, tended to go to England for further studies for architecture, the colony, okay, the motherland. When I was a student, I went to England for roughly the same reason too. I also, by the way, studied at the AA, many years after her, I would say. And she goes out, works at the AA, and she becomes the first woman who becomes a member of the RIBA, first Asian woman to become the RIBA. So she comes at a time in the 40s, influenced by modernism in a big way. And here she is with Corb in Chandigarh. She visits Corb in Chandigarh on the left. She's part of the elite. So she meets, Carlos Scarpa, she meets Frank Lloyd Wright. She knows Picasso. Mulkraj Anand is a great intellectual in India from the same group of people. So there's this whole group, Tagore, who wins the first Nobel Prize for Literature as a non-Western in 48 or 49, I forget what it was. But she comes back and sets up a practice which is based on the new architecture that's coming up from the West, which is modernism, essentially, and Siam. She comes back and does a bunch of houses. And I could talk more about her, but I'll skip faster to Bauer. But you can see the sort of modernness, and yet she begins to produce what one could call as a regionalist architecture. Regional in the sense that it's tempered, modernism is tempered by the use of local materials, the stone. It's still a concrete architecture, though bearing columns and beams. But she has the verandas, which we looked at through the colonial stuff, which is very much part of the tradition of outdoor-indoor spaces, and this is used even more by Bawa. Slightly pitched roofs, because Sri Lanka is in the tropics. Actually, pitched roofs, not slightly. And so she produces a bunch of houses. And in these modern houses, which you can see the sort of facades, there are bits of what I would say is are fragments of arts that belong to the place, whether it's a Buddhist statue, the elephant, the birds. And Corb does the same thing in Chandigarh and other places where he designs his buildings. But she overlays this modernist, the carport, this modernist with this local materials. And that begins to form the new architecture in Sri Lanka. This is the interior of the same house. Dining room. You can see very much influences of European modernism in this thing, and colors. She has another house which she designs with the same, those panels. In this case, the terracotta tiles, which are local tiles, put on top of this, the stones, the deep recesses for the climate, and well, you can see it's a sort of fairly modern house in the sense that the spaces merge into each other. and they're not the rooms, because in the old days, in Sri Lankan architecture, there are no designated rooms for particular functions, okay? The bedroom turns into a living room, the living room is somewhere where you can eat, but they're now beginning to have actual functions. So each of these rooms get functions, which is very much, if you like, a Western notion about use and space in a house. But you look at all the old houses, there's multi-use of the same rooms, sometimes depending on the upstairs and downstairs, between the summer section and the winter section. What gets used in summer is different from what gets used in winter. So it could be both climatic and use-wise. And of course the inevitable dense foliage which becomes part of it. One of her last projects is the one that she did for a cultural center, using timber, quite an intricate set of, concrete columns and then a timber roof. It's quite interesting. This was taken a few years ago, but she did it a long time, and then that was one of her last. So she's one of the early modernists who begin to bring in features that belong to the local. Now we get to Baba himself, who's a couple of years younger than she is. And he's, again, educated in the Royal College in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And it's, you know, when I say public school, remember in the British system, public school is really the private schools. And private schools they're the ones that have, you pay a lot for and you get a lot of education. And the other schools are the ones which you don't pay in. So it's very different from the state school, which is not the public schools. Just these are ones that people pay for, and quite a lot. Because he also comes from the same sort of well-off family, he's eventually sent off to study law in England. He comes from a family that has lawyers and others, again very prominent. His parents weren't quite as rich as Minette's parents or as well positioned, but they were amongst that part. And he works as a lawyer in Colombo, comes back. He hates it. He dislikes being a lawyer, he can't understand it. He's not somebody who feels comfortable in the law. And he leaves for Europe, does this trip around Europe, you know, the sort of the voyage that Cork did at points where other people have done that. And he takes the trip around, and somebody says he's fascinated by Italy, by Rome, by the vernacular in Europe, and says, I want to become an architect. So he becomes an architect. He goes back to the AA as well. So he's in the same school. And the AA is kind of important in education in the third world, in South Asia, because it has one of the early things called a tropical school. And they look at tropical architecture. They're trying to look at their own countries from the point of modernist education. So a lot of people ended up at either the, and if you had an engineering bent, you ended up in Manchester or Liverpool, but A in London becomes the sort of place. So he gets his diploma in '56 and sets up his practice. He takes over a firm, a British firm called Edwards, Reed and Bay. Edwards is the same guy who did the Parliament you saw, and I could have shown you buildings by the other guys in Colombo, sorry, the Parliament building. He keeps the name of the firm throughout his career. He never changes it. He never becomes Bawa Associates or Jeffrey Bawa Architect. It's Edwards, Reed and Bay. So whenever you look at the history of Sri Lanka, Bawa is a curious character. He's a Sri Lankan who's 6'4". He's sort of majestic. He's never married. He's an interesting sort of character. And he sets up a practice, takes over this firm, joins the firm for a bit. The old Brits go, by that time, in fact, Edwards has died and Reed and Bay disappear and go off to Southeast Asia to practice. They're practicing all over South and Southeast Asia. They go to Singapore, and you can see them, you can trace their work in different parts. But he takes over, and he gets gradually, because he's part of this commission, he gets commissions from parts of his group, he gets commission from the elite in the country. They're all his friends. So he starts off by designing the houses, and then goes on to other buildings. And of course, in 2001, won the Archon Chairman's Award. The Chairman's Award is different in that it gives a prize for person's lifetime's achievement, not for the particular building. There's also the awards are given for buildings, but he's given for another. So the two things about him is that he's really interested in nature. Nature plays a major part of the architectural works in that country, in Sri Lanka, and indeed should in most parts, and you know this famous drawing, but he talks about the tropics. Having come back from the AA with the tropical school, people like Königsberger, who become major planners in India, was at the AA, teaches him. There's a bunch of other people, Jane Drew, Maxwell Fry, a lot of modernists who are part of the AA, and who talk about climate and architecture and modernism. And he comes back and talks about a tropical architecture, but he's a modernist. Now, the thing to remember about him, he really is a modernist that comes back from being trained in the 50s, 40s and 50s, these guys, and they set up, suddenly realize it doesn't quite fit our culture, we need to look at the tropics, which is what he does. So, I'll let you sort of basically read these things. But he believes in the idea that architecture is not about a solution, but a series of solutions, and each one is tailored to the site, to the client, to the place itself, very strongly. So he's not very good at doing, say, mass housing. It's something that's not part of his makeup. He doesn't like that sort of stuff, and he's very keen. He has an amazing eye for color and detail, to do big furniture. You do the designs. He's like, in a funny way, like, Frank Lloyd Wright designs everything from the doorknobs down to the ingle and down to whatever it is, pieces to the building, to perhaps a planning in the area. And he has that sort of aesthetic sense, if you like. I'm going to talk about a number of projects. I picked a few which I think are key to trying to understand Bauer. And there's a bunch of pretty good books on Bauer. Dave Robertson had done some, and I actually published the first book on Bauer, published not as the author. My colleague Brian Taylor at Neimark did the first book, which is now known as the White Book for some weird reason, because it's white cover. And Bauer comes back and buys himself, and actually, just an aside, the White Book becomes a model for a lot of architectural books in Asia. And there's several theses being written on this, and about how that book changed publishing in South Asia, which is interesting, but that's a different story. He comes back and buys himself an old rubber plantation, about 2 or 3 hours drive from Inventor from London. So he buys this rubber plantation in the 40s, and he also sets up a new form of drawing. If you look at the way Bauer's buildings are drawn, I think we're now kind of used to seeing vernacular architecture being drawn this way, right? You've seen this sort of wonderful little sketches and plans too. You look at some plans. But it was really through his office that this form of drawing gets set up for vernacular architecture, which is also interesting. So Bauer does he works at a number of levels. He buys the house from Ganga. It's on the shores of a lake. It's an old plantation house, as I mentioned. You come up, you drive up to it. There's a patio, and then there's a sort of entrance area. This overlooks the water. A number of rooms, the living dining room, living quarters, bedrooms essentially. About 3 or 4 bedroom house, not big, modest, an old rubber plantation planter's house. It becomes changed by Bauer over 40 years. He comes to live there. He lives in Colombo, has his office in Colombo, but comes here on the weekends. It's his retreat. And so he comes into this place. And the thing that you notice about it, this is the main entrance to the house, are the steps. And when you first go there, you feel this place has been there for centuries. Because it's part of the landscape. The steps are built around it. The landscape is carefully modulated. This is the entrance going up to the house itself. You park your car literally just you could park your car here and walk up this place. And his attention to what is landscape, what exists in the landscape is a determinant factor in his architecture. You come in, this is a very plain, simple house. Of course, the Dutch doors, the double doors, which open top and bottom, which allow the air through, circulation of the air through the place. He adds little bits and pieces, doesn't mess too much with this house, but then adds a whole bunch of pavilions to it, which we'll look at quickly. He produces this, if you like, a micro landscape within the bigger landscape. The thing about Bauer is when you look at those steps, you look at the trees, you look at this thing, you think, ah, well, of course, this has been here for a long time. It's all done by Bauer. It's a manufactured landscape. And he creates views, places to sit, places to look out. He cuts the trees in a certain way. Bauer used to walk up and down his gardens, and he'd walk with the gardeners who went with him to help cut the place, cut the trees and so on. And he'd look and say, you know, I want that bush cut down 2 feet because I want the view to the water, or something of that sort. So it's a very manicured landscape. It looks like nature. You think, oh no, this has not got the hand of a human hand in it, but it is. That's just the inside. He takes, he does a few things. Brings in false ceilings in order to suspended ceilings in order to get rid of the structure. It's pretty awful about it. He's got columns. This furniture is fairly a combination of fairly modern stuff and this antique. So he's got a very eclectic taste. There's this wonderful tree which faces the living room. This is the opposite side of the entrance. And he would quite often sit out here and you dine outside. The thing is, you can live outside. So you live outside or inside. You live out as much as you do. Outdoor rooms are a very important part of that architecture, and he creates that. When I first went to this house many years ago, and met up with him and talked to him, he did something. He was very conscious about how he wanted me to see the house, how he wanted me to see the house. So we'd walk around, and then we had lunch here, and he would sit me in a particular seat. And the seat would have the view of this tree. And he wanted me to get the best view of that tree. He did this to everyone, by the way, not just me. And he's very conscious that his architecture was a set of scenographic moves, a certain kind of a narrative that was set up by a sequence of spaces. And we'll look at a few more others. So the temple tree was very important to him. Look at this sort of, the way that he cut the soil on the ground, highly, again, contrived. That's continued down towards from the tree, looking down to the water, and he created a chessboard on the ground, which at one stage actually had these big chess figures for effect. I'm not sure he was a great chess player, but he just wanted to be part of that and create battlefields. So he was very aware of how seasons changed, the planting cycles of whether it's grass or rice or whatever it is, and he would take advantage. A statue that he put down. He had statues all over the place, which he added to it. And again, you think of this, it's almost like I've entered an old temple. I'm in Angkor Wat or something of that sort, but it isn't. This is probably about 10 years old. Of course, the climate and the humidity takes its toll upon things like this. So they look old. This is looking back at the house. You can see the wall of that, the parapet there, the house is behind it, the temple tree is beyond it. A pathway which he creates, he's got he's got the paddy fields, and you walk along there. This is looking back again at this structure, at that piece. And so gradually the house increases and changes. He adds new pavilions. For instance, if you remember, the plan was really that. He adds a whole new pavilion, which is essentially a guest house, and downstairs it's his sort of art gallery. So he creates these follies in the park, and each one is created in a very interesting and careful way. So this happens to be just a folly in which you go and sit and look at the landscape. He creates paths and he marks them by all these old pots. He does all sorts of little architectural tricks. There's a pavilion which he sits in, again, as a threshold between two different areas. Statue, the god Pan music, and the paddy fields again. That's that building over there, which is open and has a space upstairs. That's a bedroom, basically. It's his guest house, because his own house has only got a couple of bedrooms and a suite that he uses. So he creates this. Again, these are new buildings. When I say new, these happen to be dating from about the 70s, early 70s, and then there's others. He keeps adding them until his death, until his 1980s and so on. The view through it. That's his tree house, or his space where he puts guests up. That's the room upstairs. And he's got this old plantation British furniture, right? The chairs that allow the air breeze to come through them, the cane furniture, very much traditional. He's got lamps, those which come from the Dutch and the British and the Portuguese. And he's got paintings by friends. He's part of that artistic scene. And you think this is a jungle and this is part of nature. It's actually planted by power. It's actually contrived in that sense. There's a hill that he clears. This is looking from the house down the road. He's actually got another whole lot of guest houses. He can do these things. He can play these games and be a folly and do these things because he happens to be reasonably well off even before he became an architect. So he's lucky. He's actually buried here. His ashes are here. He died here when he was sick. So that in the landscape, because Pratik was saying, his own residence in Colombo in the city is somewhat different. He takes a number of townhouses and puts them together. So there's a set of townhouses which he puts together. And if you were to do this as an architectural drawing or an architectural plan, I mean, there's a good chance that one's professors would say, what the hell's going on here? Look at those little spaces, these are courtyards open to the sky. What are those about? Some of them are not usable, but they're visual clues. So you would come, this is the main street is there on the left, and he'd park those cars. He had a Rolls Royce which he loved, and sort of a yellow Rolls Royce which he used to mainly sit in the Rolls Royce and look at the building. He used to travel in his own Mercedes, which he had too. And so you find it very interesting. There's a bench here, and he'd sit in the Rolls and look at the bench, and then he'd sit in the bench and look at the Rolls. And the floors, that's the main entrance. You come into this place, and the floors are painted white. So think of it, climate, tropical climate, white floors, wet. But in Sri Lanka, he had all the, you come in, and behind you, an Indian is there cleaning up the floors as you go through. And so he's strange. He has all these rooms. Again, I remember when I was there for lunch one day, and this was his dining room, and he sat me here because he wanted me to look at the tree. So it's one of those things, again, he's very conscious of what he do. His main living space is back here, and an open courtyard. Now, some of the courtyards are just for air. Water comes into them, he manages to drain it. So he has about 14 courtyards in this place. They're really, and some of this here is the Rolls Royce looking at the entrance, and there's this white floor, there's the bench. So he's very conscious about that progression in relationship to nature. That's the back, going towards the back. He had a friend called Donald Friend, who's actually was an Australian artist who made Sri Lanka his home, and Donald Friend did a lot of works for him. There's his place which he sat in. You could sit in out of the rain, or you could sit when it's raining, you sat out of the rain, or you'd actually just sit and the rain would come and you'd watch the rain, and the sound of the rain is part of his architecture. Very much both a haptic and a sensory experience in his case. I just want to throw a couple of things about his office. This is where he worked. Again, an old house, which he takes, very much part of the vernacular. And it's now a restaurant. So these were taken when it was a restaurant. I got some old photographs somewhere. Bauer used to sit where his photograph was taken from. His desk was there, and he would sit in this courtyard actually and draw and work in this place. So the way and how he practiced is very much reflected in his architecture, or how his architecture is very much reflected in the way he lived and what he did. So it was part of his whole being, if you like. In the 60s, there's an important person in Bauer's life called Ulrich Plessner, who is an Israeli architect, comes to Sri Lanka as a young man, and that's Bauer, and that's Ulrich in the early 60s. And Ulrich decides to work with Bauer, and there's really a partnership formed in which they affect each other's work. Plessner is still alive, he's not very well, apparently he's in Tel Aviv, and I've been trying to get somebody to write a book about him because he's done extraordinary, wonderful projects in India and in Israel, and of course in Colombo with Bauer as well. But they were partners and they fed off each other. They both believed in the same things. I believe that I never met Plessner. I've been in touch with him, but not otherwise. And they designed this house out in the countryside, in the middle of nowhere. It was actually, I think it was the Prime Minister who wanted a house built out in the countryside, and they said, well, and they were going to, the normal thing would, they'd prefab the thing and ship it into the country, ship it out there, because you can't get materials. But Bauer said, no, I'll build it from scratch, and we'll build it in rocks. So Plessner and he, this is actually attributed to both, and it's hard to figure out who did what when they designed. But this is the house in the countryside, which is a series of a couple of small pavilions. These are the huge rocks that occur, and they build this building to actually use the rocks in a very skillful way. It's a concrete structure, part of it. It has the roofs. The advantage is you can live on the outside, right? As long as you keep out of the rain, you can live out 365 days of the year in nature itself. Which is what they do. There are a couple of bedrooms in it. This is the house itself. This happens to be, I think this was a bedroom that they designed a bit precarious with that rock. I don't know whether you feel comfortable lying in bed with this rock. Anyway. There were some rooms, there were a couple of bedrooms which you could lock a door and have privacy, but otherwise it's all open. It's open living that changes. Another house he does for a doctor, Ash de Silva, again, fairly educated, who has his offices here, and then he has his house here. If you take that section is across. Taken here, as you can see. There's this one roof that goes all the way across. So the section is united under a roof, and the landscape and the topography does what it does, and he uses that as part of the building. It's actually quite skillful. That's the entrance to the house. He has several entrances. You come in here, and you can go into the garden. You come in here, and you go into the house. So there's two or three ways into each. Security was not a big problem in those days. Sorry, it's lagging a little bit in terms of. That's the entrance when you come in. to the house, and then the water comes, allows the water to come into the pool. So again, back and forth. This question of water is very important, and the walking up to the entrance and through. You recognize this building? Anyone? Alto, okay? The reason I want to show this was there's a section, if you notice that first section of the roofs that unite under the landscape. And Alto does that in a few of his projects. Now, Klesner says that they were influenced by Alto. Jeffrey never admitted being influenced by anyone, but that's his own way. But it's kind of interesting what he did. He's done a bunch of hotels, which are quite beautiful. This was inspired by the forts, at least according to Jeffrey. You can see the section. You enter here into this space. You come up to the hotel, so you really see a fortification of the wall in a sense. And then each of these rooms overlook the water. So all the rooms are looking towards the water in some way, and then the public spaces are up. There's a pool, and the sea is down this end. So you come into this, you park your car gets parked, you get dropped off, and you go up some stairs. They had to put in an elevator eventually because of handicap access. And you come up the stairs, and as you come up the stairs, you look up, and you see this batik panels done by Barbara Sansoni. These amazing panels which he did for him. So he would collaborate with these artists, and it's very much this, I walk somewhere, I stop, my head raises, and I see something. And his architecture is about this kind of progression and the idea of framing views as well. That's the inevitable, that's the floor plan and the roof plan of the rooms and the old architects to see. Another hotel which actually was damaged unfortunately in the tsunami, but it's now been renovated and restored by ex-students of Bawa. And there's something, it's in the middle, it's not so far from his house actually, this is the same area as his house. The road comes along and you come down this long path. These are actually the service areas where the staff also live. When you come down this path, you come all the way into this, and there's your reception area. And Bawa, you come down, there's the reception area, there's that pool, and there's the sea. So you come down, and he creates this scene where, as you drive down, this is what you see. This is this artificial pool with the trees in it, which actually surprisingly survived still. Open entry hallways. You come in, this is where the reception desk is, and if you think about it, you come through this piece of water in the entrance, you come into this reception, very highly polished concrete, okay? So the very highly polished concrete is almost like a reflection of the water continuing, and then you look out, that's coming in from the outside into this, and then, sorry, that's where you come in, you're into this, and then you look out and you see the sea beyond this. So this reception to the swimming pool, to the sea. But sometimes if you come and you see this, you see these layers of shiny surfaces which looks like water, continuing. So he really choreographs both your visual and the senses of where you are. It's quite beautifully done. This is the restored version of it. And then the rooms overlook. I remember going there with Bawa once, and he would turn up in his buildings every once in a while, and he'd walk down, and the poor manager who was there would be quaking with fear, because Bawa would come along and say, "You've put that chair in the wrong position," and he'd give the manager hell, and because although he had nothing to do with the hotel anymore, it was about 20 years before, everyone would pay attention to Bawa. He's one of those guys who said, this is what it should be, and they would pay attention to it. This is the lobby which overlooks the sea. These panels drop down when the rains come, they go up when the rains are gone, but it's all outdoor space. There are some air-conditioned spaces there too. Bauer goes from houses and details to designing the new Parliament building in Colombo, which is obviously a big project on this reclaimed land in the middle of it. Creates an artificial lake and creates this. Again, if you think about it, it's the vernacular being used, but scaled up very much larger. Okay. He designs this place in Kote, Sri Lanka, does the army. He does this as a turnkey job with Japanese contractors. And the Japanese don't like the way Bauer works, because he'd do these little sketches on a piece of paper, he'd go on site and say, change this, do that. But apparently they came to accommodation because the Japanese and some Korean contractor, Japanese essentially, realized that they were in the presence of somebody who had great talent. So somehow they managed to work their way through into this working relationship and creates this. You can see the, if you like, precedents that become part of his. You saw these slides before anyway. And Bauer's sketches, he would sketch these things. He was lucky. Bauer's lucky because he had a Sri Lankan engineer who actually translated all this stuff into engineering. It's like, Korb was lucky he had Jenner, he had Charlotte, Perron, whatever it was. These people who actually helped Korb realize their visions. Frank Gehry is lucky because he's got whatever his name is. Anyway, what is it? Thank you. To help him realize. But the sketches and the ideas come from this one hand. He's very much part of it. And so he gets the local vernacular of the roof, quite simple, concrete structures, stucco, and this is a building that's on a different scale, and maybe not quite the same. Actually, the quality is pretty good, concrete and so on. I'm just going to go through this. That's the interior, which he does all the interior layouts and design of the main hall. That's his sketches done by his office. That's not a Bauer sketch, but done by somebody in his office. The young architects. He has a bunch of young architects who work with him. Yeah, sorry, I've got a few minutes left. So I'm going to just go through very quickly. I'm going to talk about these projects a little bit, but what I'll just do is, because of this, Bauer creates this university, which is divided into 3 sections. He does a farm school, which becomes the influence, and the monasteries that become, and this is his new University of Ruhenu, and he's got 2 sections of it. And again, each of these are bunches of privileges, from smaller to bigger, from science blocks to the art buildings to the residences, and they're separated by a valley that overlook the water. So residences for the faculty are here, and this is the actual university itself. And he designed this on a very strict grid. Now this comes back to his modernist upbringing, where it's a grid. It's a 3 by 3 meter grid and a vertical. So the whole thing was done on every piece of this. But the way he puts it together, nothing is repetitive, or the grid is repetitive. The structure becomes repetitive in terms of the laying out of columns. So there's an order to this, but when you walk through it, you don't think this is if you like, a sterile order, but it's really very innovative. So he's got these things, of course. Again, you walk through, because you've got to walk out of the rain and out of the sun, there are all these covered connections that tie the whole campus together. Views. He's got a couple of 4-story buildings, but most of it is 2 to 3 stories. So he's got 50 different pavilions or buildings, and he uses 4 or 5 materials, the same roofs, the concrete structures, the paving that is the same, and the wood pieces in between. That's Bauer in his office, which he looks like. So he does a hotel not far from Canby in the middle, takes his inspiration from some temples, but I that's it. When you're far away, this is in a very sensitive site because it's near one of the very biggest street was. And so that last, that image, you can't see the building. This is it from the air before the foliage took over. But that's the building, and there it is. It's hardly visible from the lake because this is a sensitive spot. And the only reason the owner got permission to build this building was because Bauer was the architect. And even though you look at it, all it is it's a modernist column Gaussian structure, and it's a very modern building, very simple, but it's the landscape that makes it what it is. So the building was set in the rocks. There's this huge rock hill behind it, the water in front of it. The section is quite interesting too. That's the entrance. So again, we've given the 5-minute warning, so we're going to just rush through this. This is before the plants started growing over the windows completely, but now they're actually totally covered. As you can see, there's a set of swimming pools, waterfalls. That's the dining hall. There are rooms along this edge which fall down the hill at the back. And he's electrical elephant trunks. This is looking at the back, so both sides of the building he uses as rocks, and back to get a personal idea of being in the landscape itself. The rooms overlook the lake. As you can see, the bathrooms are actually completely open. So if you're in the bathrooms and having a bath or a shower or sitting on the throne and looking out at nature, the thing is, there's no curtains or anything. But the other bank is so far away that no one can ever see. You can't see a speck. And so he feels that you should be part of this, participate in the landscape. So this bathtub is part of the renovation. There was bedrooms. They've added a spa on the roof. This is the green roof, so everything is a green roof as well. There's a guy called Laki who does wonderful plan as a bird. It's the main entrance that you saw. The rooms go off on two sides. So if I may, I'll end up with a couple of quick, I'm just going to run through these and not even talk about them because of the time constraint, unfortunately. Bevis Bauer is Bauer's brother, elder brother. And people think that Bevis is actually, even more talented than Bauer in terms of landscape. And this is Bevis's house, not far from Jeffrey's house in Ben Georgia. And the gardens are quite extraordinary. This Bevis was very different from Bauer. Bevis was an army officer for a while. Then he was also a lawyer for a while. He worked for the British government. He was the adjunct to ministers. And he designs. So this was done about the same time as Bauer's own house. And the question's always been asked who was influencing who and what was being done. So it's very hard to tell. But they were jealous of each other. They were cordial. They were close. Bevis was very much openly gay. Bauer was not. Bevis used to have these amazing parties and did all sorts of interesting things in this. But he had the same sensibility to landscape that Bauer has. So this is, you can see something I want to talk about. That's the house. Again, part of it is an old house, part of it is new. He creates these steps. Laki, who does the sculptures, I find he's a really interesting character. He's the one who does a lot of drawings for Bauer. And this is Laki's own house built, and he worked for Bauer for a number of years. And so this is Laki's retreat, if you like, away from. It's supposed to be a video, that's supposed to play, let's forget it. Follows Anula Ratnavibhushna, who works for Bauer for many years. So there's a bunch of younger architects, and now these guys are all in their 60s, so they're not young architects by any means anymore. But they use the same. You notice the technique of drawing? It's very much taken from Bauer. They learned it in Bauer's office. They look at landscape in the same way, and they all become quite important architects in their own right. This is his own house. He sold it, now lives in the city. but he and his wife. But the guy who takes over Bauer's, what I call the mantle, his mantle, is Angelo, who is seen here with Bauer in his later days in the Crimea War. And Angelo sort of looks after Bauer, and now there's some extraordinary, quite beautiful buildings. He's born in 1951. He goes to University College and believes very much in that architecture has a healing power, which is what Bauer also believed in terms of architecture and landscape. It has the ability to soothe, to heal, to inspire. So it's not just about answering a brief, a program. It really is about architecture with a certain purpose that's much beyond within the landscape. This is a SOS children's village. He's different from Bauer because he actually becomes back to the roots of modernism, as the last hotel of Bauer's does. That's a very modernist, simple hotel, but the way it's set in the landscape, the way it's placed, the way you move through the spaces, it makes it very special. But this guy uses color because it's for kids. He's done 3 or 4 SOS villages. Bauer's also done, by the way, at least 1 SOS villages and some other stuff for nuns and other things. Scale is different, and ends up, this is, well, he's done a whole bunch of other houses, and this happens to be what he calls a Marzinan house, and he's going back to using the same principles, but now much more back to the axial geometries, fairly modern, but the same principles of living out in the landscape. And Angelandra's own house is actually quite beautiful, amongst other ones, but this is for a client who's an American. Angelandra collects art the way Bauer did. And so Angelandra will go and find art for the client and say, you've got to buy this, you've got to do that. And Angelandra's got an amazing art collection as well, as does Bauer, of Sri Lankan and local artists. It's quite, it's a very simple, straightforward, it's a very beautiful, elegant piece. And there's Bauer, and towards the end of his later parts of his life, towards the end of his life, sitting with Angela and Ratna Bush, Shema, and another figures in the land. So the fact that Bauer dies in the 80s, late 80s, his legacy continues, and the impact on Southeast Asia, you look at hotels, people like Kerry Hill, Woha, we're talking about really interesting and very modern architecture in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, in Australia. Kerry Hill does major buildings in Australia and elsewhere. And you talk to any architect in Southeast Asia, from Japan to Korea to Thailand, they will acknowledge that Bauer set up a way of looking at landscape, a way of using contemporary architecture and fitting into this region's idiom that has had this impact that's continued. It's rather like Fatih, who built Hassan Fatih in the Middle East, in Egypt, built in a certain vernacular, which he created, which is an artificial vernacular. Bauer does the same thing. He creates a new vernacular, and which then gets taken and developed with sometimes very modernist views by other people in this thing. Anyway, that's it. Thank you. Sorry, it's a little curtailed, a little bit shorthand in some cases, but anyway. If there are any quick questions, I'll be happy to.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. I learned quite a bit. I understand that some of you need to leave. Those of you that need to leave, please do so. Professor Hassan and I will be here for 5-10 more minutes to take some questions for those of you.
Or anything that you want to ask about. Bauer. I guess I was lucky that I met Bauer when I did, because I went to some conference in Sri Lanka, in Kuala Lumpur, and they had well-known Australian architects, well-known Southeast Asian, and then up came Bauer, and he showed his architecture. He didn't like talking about his architecture. So when he gave a lecture, he said, "Well, you can judge what my architecture is." Click, 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 the slides in those days. and didn't say anything about his architecture. But the impact of, if you like, the images, and there's a whole lot of other ones. I mean, these are mainly my images, but he had a bunch of them, and the drawings that he showed. I think he certainly wowed me, and he wowed a lot of people. And from important Peter Miller and other important Australian architects, somebody said, here's somebody. And he hadn't been well known. And in fact, the first exhibition we put together, I helped some friends of Jeffrey's put together an exhibition of the Royal Institute of British Architects in the 80s at one time. It was the first time that his work had really got any attention outside Sri Lanka. But in Sri Lanka, he's really well known. You know, everyone said, here's the master. We know that he was an extraordinary important architect. But it's only when that thing came out, and then the white book came out, and a portfolio of Jeffrey's drawings came out, drawings about buildings, that suddenly people started paying attention to him. And as I said, he's really become a significant. To me, he's one of the great architects of the 20th century, compared with anyone, anywhere in Europe. Not just because it's about an interpretation of vernacular and modernism, but just the beauty of what he does. It's really inspirational. I put a quote in there in Lamaprakos, it said a sacred place. And I was wandering around the gardens one day by myself and I looked and I said, isn't this, and I came across the guy who was cutting the grass and doing this stuff in the garden. And I said, this is a wonderful place. And he said, yeah, it's a sacred place. Thank you. Any other big subject?
I have a question that maybe links Bao's formation to something you talked about. Maybe this is just parallel to his work, but I'm interested in it because it's something that we're dealing with in some of the studios, which is the influence that education abroad or knowledge generated somewhere can have an effect when it's sort of foreign and at the same time local. And that was education at the AA. The AA has had a huge impact also in Latin America,
right.
And it's really interesting to see how in the past 15, 20 years that sort of went back and some schools are trying to pick up, I think, on that legacy. And having you studied also in the AA, I'm interested in hearing what's your experience.
But I think it's interesting because Bauer's talked about something, I was there in the 60s, okay? Bauer was there in the 50s, at least 15 years before. I was there in the late 60s and early 70s. And he came up with the moment of modernism in Siam and the early modernists. I came at a time when Piano and Rogers were my teachers, at that moment of time. There are people that way. People like Ken Yang were my classmates, for instance. He was my classmate at the AA when he came to Cambridge. There's a bunch of people. But it's interesting, Bauer said something that is, the two things that really influenced his architecture is one, going away. And Salman Rushdie's written about this, Robert Louis Stevenson's written about this. You go away and you look at your own country with different eyes. And he said, having gone away made me look at Sri Lanka and I began to understand what my country was about. And I felt the same thing. It's only when I left Pakistan, I'm from Pakistan. When I left Pakistan and I went to England to study, for the first time I looked at my country because one belonged to a certain kind of elite and you took things for granted. It wasn't that you were totally oblivious, but you took things for granted and that's how you lived. And Bauer said that was one thing. And the other thing that hit him, as it did Paul and Hurl, is the journey. You know, it's when Ruskin went through Europe, and that affected the way Ruskin thought about art and architecture. Bauer's journey through Europe, which he took just before he took up architecture, really affected the way that he looked at the world. And he learned from all these other cultures, and then began to say, okay, what is important about the vernacular? What's important about the ideas of modernism, the theories of modernism? And he would, you know, once you got him talking, he would actually talk reasonably eloquently, but he's only written, I think, 2 small pieces, and one is reproduced in the White Book. and he's written a couple of others in newspapers and something else. And people have interviewed him, for sure, but he didn't like talking about it. But in those, you get the sense that you discover yourself by going away. And you discover your country by being part of some other place. And that is certainly very much. But he comes back to the country. He's lucky enough to have sets of clients who understand what he's about. Because they're the artists, they're the intellectuals themselves. And there's this woman in Sri Lanka, which there's a whole bunch of them, both men and women, who are both as important as each other, or more. They influence each other. And so he looks at his own country. So I think, and I do believe there's something about that. You go abroad, you do discover who you are. It helps you discover who you are when you travel, when you see other cultures. He certainly said that all the time.
I was just thinking about the kind of the vernacular style of the tropical South Asia being used for catering different clientele, because I'm aware of some of Laurie Baker's work.
Sure.
It's kind of similar style, but for low-income housing group.
Yeah. Well, but Laurie Baker also uses brick, mud brick and brick. He uses thatch. He uses slightly. But you're right. I mean, Laurie Baker does two things though, which Bauer doesn't. I mean, certainly one thing that Laurie Baker's interested in how people build for themselves, and then says, okay, architecture is about that relationship between the builder and the users, okay? Bauer's actually interested in architecture as art, really. He doesn't care if you and I build. Baker did. He was very much part of the training process, understanding the cultural. Bauer was interested in knowing what, if you like, the architecture means to him in a reinterpretation of certain architecture. Baker, in a funny way, who I think is really there's only one book out on Baker ever, and I knew Baker a little bit and visited him on several occasions, and I think he's a really underrated architect who needs to be understood, because he did something else, was what Fatih never really did. But Fatih said, build with the people. Baker actually did it. And you look at the construction, the construction of his buildings, the way he uses brick, the way he uses thatch. He understood what the local, and the thing about Baker, which is just to make a digression, that Baker tried to get the government of India to produce mass housing based on Baker's ideas. And you see the letters to the minister and his disappointment when no one could understand what Baker was trying to do. And so he never did that. I mean, he did beautiful houses, he did some housing, he did some churches and other important buildings, but he was never able to move the government to adopt his way of building for housing, which is what he said was, in a way, he believed that we should look at housing for people in general. So although they have a view to the vernacular, I think Laurie Baker was much more concerned with the vernacular, where Bauer was really a sort of a modernist who brought in this kind of regionalism. So I think of Bauer as much a modernist in the way he lays out, the way he uses the grid, the way he uses structure, that comes from his education from Europe. And so does Minette Silva. Minette and he was friends, by the way. They were sort of, it was okay, they were never rivals, they did different things, but they were friends, they were part of that same elitist group. So there was a bunch of people in those days that were part of that. That continues, that tradition of the monist in Sri Lanka continues in a big way. And there's some wonderful architects there at the moment, younger ones in their 30s and 40s, young. So that's a nice one. Yeah, they're both architects, one was looking at certain bakeries, for sure. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I would say that if you've got these books, Baker, like Offenbach, I think it's really a nice, it's a badly produced, I mean, badly printed book, and it's not, you know, it doesn't have the joy of some of the Bauer books, which are, or the Bauer portfolios, which I think there's something nice about books that feel good as well. Bauer's do, Baker's don't, but their architecture is worth looking at. I think there's a bunch of others in South East, including, I think David Robson's done his book called After Bauer, and he talks about all the other young architects that come after him. And there's a young photographer who photographed a lot of Bauer's work, called Barbara Sansoni's son, in fact, who's Dominique Sansoni, who's done some beautiful, beautiful images, both in black and white. He's written a book on the house in black and white. I think there's, colour is an important part of it, which doesn't actually bring in. But there are a few books on these guys which maybe help you understand what Sri Lanka, what the texture of Sri Lanka is about, what the texture of the architecture could be, what detailing is, what is the relationship to water, which is a big one. How do you get the water off, how do you collect water, how do you recycle it? Because now people are getting into that end of it, which Bauer was aware of all this thing about recycling things. He was certainly aware of climate, positioning, how to set things in a landscape, of wind, movement of cross-ventilation. But I think now people are looking at some of the other things. And the hotel he did in Kandalama, which is in the middle of nowhere, the way he constructed it, using local labor and local materials and details, it's actually a LEED certified, it's only a bronze, but it's a LEED certified building, which of course the hotel people put up proudly as a big tax. We're LEED certified. Bauer didn't care a damn about that. But he did collect the rainwater for the hotel, he recycled it, he's got solar collectors, a wind farm off on the side, because it's in the middle of nowhere, so it had to be self-sufficient. And so that's his last project. And so at the end of his life, and even in the beginning, the lessons of the vernacular are very much part of his architecture. They really are. So that's why he's a strange, I call him tropical, modern, regionalist. I don't know what he is. But he's all these things. And that's why I think, architecture which gives you bang for your buck, and architecture doesn't just do one thing. It can do 6 different things. And economically it works as well. And so that's what makes him really quite good, because he understood these processes and how actually people use buildings as well. Okay?
Well, thank you so much.